I have thoughts about the new Xenoblade. This video will contain location and general world spoilers for the end of Xenoblade 2, but besides that, no other part of any other Xeno game will be spoiled. Xenoblade Genesis' combat will probably be substantially different from the combat of previous Xenoblade games. There are two ways I can see the combat for Genesis going. One is that Genesis could stick with the MMO base from the Xenoblade series, but drastically change it, i.e. keep the basic foundation of using auto attacks to fill up cooldowns in, but change pretty much everything else. Kind of like a Xenoblade 1 to Xenoblade 2 situation, but even more drastic. The second way I can see them doing the combat is to completely change the combat system from an MMO-like to something else, like an action RPG. The problem with this is that the character action genre is already very well saturated in JRPGs. Meanwhile, there are very few games that have Xenoblade's MMO-style combat except for actual MMOs and like Final Fantasy XII, I guess. Because of this, I think it's much more likely that Monolith Soft at least keeps the roots of the MMO combat system for this new game, but besides that, it's anybody's guess what the combat could look like. This is the first time we've had a new Xenoblade game that has very similar visuals to the last new Xenoblade game that released before it. X looks completely different from 1, 2 looks completely different from X, and 3 looks completely different from 2. However, Genesis looks very similar to Xenoblade 3. Obviously, I don't mean that in terms of art direction. In terms of art direction, Genesis is completely isolated from the rest of the Xenoblade series. The only game it can really be compared to in that area is Xenoblade 2, due to that also being a very fantasy-focused world. But the specific flavor of high fantasy presented to us in Genesis seems to be very different from 2. When I talk about Genesis looking very similar to Xenoblade 3, I'm talking more about art style and technology related to the art style, rather than art direction. I think the best way to illustrate this is to look at the character models. If you compare Xenoblade 2 character models to Xenoblade 3 character models, even if you weren't familiar with the Xenoblade series at all, you'd immediately be able to tell that those are two separate games. They obviously both have an anime art style, but elements like cell shading, character proportions, and other character details are very clearly distinct. Meanwhile, if you compare Xenoblade 3 characters to characters in Genesis, the designs on clothing are obviously very different, but things like cell shading and how eyes look are very similar. I don't think someone who wasn't already familiar with the series would assume that these are two separate games just by looking at the characters. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Reusing technology and the art style from Xenoblade 3 and Genesis may have cut down on development time that would have otherwise needed to be spent on defining a new art style. Monolith Soft may be using similar technology for the visuals of Genesis from 3 in order to save on dev time by reusing a visual style that people were overall very positive about. A lot of people are having a gut reaction to the high fantasy world of Genesis, saying that it doesn't feel like a real Xeno game or that Genesis is breaking new ground for the series by being this high fantasy and having no sci-fi elements. I immediately take issue with the accusation that there are no sci-fi elements in this trailer, since I'm pretty sure that the big structure we see in that clip of the red-haired dude riding the dragon could very much be a crashed spaceship. But even if it isn't, a new Xenoblade game presenting itself as high fantasy is not even remotely new. Xenoblade 2, which I have to assume that most of the Xenoblade fanbase is intimately familiar with, is also an extremely high fantasy game at first glance. Not even first glance, actually. Like, for a good 70% of its runtime, Xenoblade 2 has basically no sci-fi elements. So no, this isn't new at all. The only way Genesis could be seriously disassociating itself from the rest of the Xeno series with its setting is if once this game releases and we play through it, we find out that it has zero sci-fi elements whatsoever. That would be very different for the series, as every mainline Xeno game, without exception, starting back with Xenogears in 1997, has had some degree of sci-fi elements. And also usually mechs specifically. Even Xenoblade 2, which as I mentioned before does go most of its runtime without having any sci-fi elements whatsoever, has a space elevator filled with mechs and glowing autonomous motorcycles for its final dungeon. So yes, if Genesis ends up having no sci-fi elements at all, that would be quite the departure for the series. However, it's very unlikely that this will be the case. As I said, the closest analog we have for Genesis in this series in terms of games that look very fantasy is Xenoblade 2, and Xenoblade 2 still has very crucial sci-fi elements towards the end of its story. I imagine this will also probably be the case for Genesis. If you had the gut reaction to the Genesis reveal trailer that it's a huge departure for the series because of its high fantasy aesthetic, I would seriously encourage you to rewatch Xenoblade 2's reveal trailer. I like the cell shading on distant objects in the landscape. It's kind of like how distant landscapes in Tales of Arise looked like a watercolor painting. Obviously, Xenoblade Genesis's distant cell shading isn't as extreme as that, but it still looks really cool and gives a more stylized vibe to everything, for lack of a better term. While it's not outright confirmed that flying mounts will be a thing in this game, I have ample reason to believe they will be. We already see in the revealed trailer that some mounts do exist, with the party riding these horses. Well, they're not really horses, they're a weird god mistake hybrid of bird and dog, but they seem to function as horses, so I'm gonna call them horses. While this could be the only type of mount we get in the game, I doubt it. In one shot in the trailer, we see what appears to be the male party member with bright orange hair riding a dragon. Now, this scene does look like a cutscene and not gameplay, but still. It's a party member riding a flying mount in a game that we 100% know has some form of controllable mounts in gameplay. So I'm guessing that while yes, the dragon riding we see here is in a cutscene, we'll still be able to ride dragons in the final game. Also, Xenoblade has had flying mounts before with the flying scales in Xenoblade X, so the player being able to fly is absolutely something Monolith Soft knows how to handle. Being able to use flying mounts in this game really has the potential to make full use of the uniqueness of Genesis's open world being a hollow sphere. Being able to fly from one end of the map to the other by flying up instead of forwards or backwards, for example, would be a method of traversal I haven't ever seen in an open world game before. I also just want to take a moment here to point out how absolutely kick-ass it is to have an open world game take place inside of a hollow planet. Like, being able to see every region of the game world from wherever you are by looking forward, backwards, and up is such a novel idea. Like, Xenoblade for a while had a real reputation of having really weird open world gimmicks. Gimmicks not in terms of gameplay necessarily, but in how you understand the layout of the world. Xenoblade 1 had fairly conventional open world fantasy design for the most part, but the little visual reminders that you were scaling a long dead giant humanoid creature the entire time really sold that game as a whole. Xenoblade 2 kind of reused that same gimmick well, with more smaller living giants making up the world. Xenoblade 2 even incorporated a gameplay gimmick a little bit with this idea, by allowing you to wait for the Titan you're on to wade deeper into or rise from the Cloud Sea, opening up and blocking access to various areas of the Titan. Xenoblade 2 didn't really use that mechanic much, but it's cool that it's there. Xenoblade 3 and Xenoblade X are much more conventional though. X just takes place on an alien planet, but it's saved in terms of being memorable by how much Monolith Soft broke the bank with weird creature designs and incredibly creative regions that played off of standard sci-fi tropes. Xenoblade 3's world design isn't terribly memorable. Like, it's very fun to explore and looks pretty enough, but ideas-wise, a world that's composed of a giant ring doesn't really feel that different moment to moment from a game that just takes place on any old planet. That's why I'm so grateful that Genesis is reclaiming Xenoblade's reputation for having really weird and memorable visual premises for its worlds. I think Genesis might actually end up being the most impactful Xenoblade game in that area, as Genesis's hollow planet not only is really unique to look at, it also has pretty massive gameplay implications, especially if the game has flying mounts like I proposed earlier. Even if it doesn't, how the unique shape of the world subtly changes the way you gather visual information about the world and how you decide where to go next is pretty massive. Honestly, I think this hollow planet open world might legitimately be the aspect of Genesis that I'm most excited about. Like, I'm sure it'll have a pretty fantastic story like all Xenoblade games do. I've just never quite seen anything like what Genesis is attempting to do with its world in other open world games, and that's awesome. Makes me very happy as a Xenoblade fan. I don't think Genesis will have any loading screens when traversing the open world, especially if there are flying mounts. This is just a pretty easy guess to make about the game regardless of what its world design is. Genesis is a Switch 2 exclusive game. I imagine the Switch 2 is powerful enough compared to the Switch 1 to allow for an open world game on the scale of a modern Xenoblade game to run without loading screens. Also, Monolith Soft has shipped an open world game without loading screens before with both releases of Xenoblade X on 2 different platforms. Also, I don't think it would even be feasible for Monolith Soft to include loading screens in the overworld of Genesis because it takes place inside a hollow planet. I imagine it's much easier to include loading screens that load in parts of the world you're going to when you can't see all parts of the world at all times like you seemingly can in Genesis. In Genesis, all parts of the world that you would have to be able to see from a top-down view of a normal flat world in a video game will essentially have to be loaded in at all times to some degree in Genesis. Plus, I don't even know where you would place loading screens, since I think you can just theoretically at least swim in whatever direction you want across the planet. Like, maybe this will be the first Xenoblade game where you can't swim, but I'm gonna assume that's not the case. Monolith Soft can make all the linear pathways they want, but that doesn't really mean much in terms of how they can load in the rest of the world if you can just choose to hop in the ocean at any point and just swim to another continent. Most of the land masses in this game could be elevated at least slightly above the ocean, so that you can't get onto one via the ocean, and the game can maintain linearity for which order you discover the different regions. But it should still be theoretically possible for you to be able to at least touch most regions via the ocean. Okay, so the day and night cycle is weird with this game, right? Because with most games that have a day and night cycle, they just make logical sense because the game has a, manufactured horizon line for the sun to dip under to transition to night, and then a horizon for the sun to rise from to transition to day. That can't work in this game because, there is no horizon. It takes place inside a hollow planet. So, assuming the game is still going to have a day and night cycle, how does that work? I think the way it might work might be a little weird. So, at the end of the trailer, we see what looks like a cutscene of a short girl with a staff. She looks like a party member, shooting some magical particle effects by doing a dance into the sky where the 5 artificial looking suns are. There's normally a 6th sun there during some other parts of the trailer that looks a bit more real than the other ones. I think that 6th sun is what's actually making the sunlight for the game world. So what I think might happen is that since the game can't really have a natural quote-unquote day and night cycle, I think you as the player are going to have to summon the sun into the sky doing that little ritual that you see in the cutscene. Like maybe the sun just like fades naturally as the day goes on, it burns out. So then you as a player, if you want daylight, you have to make like a spell to make the sun appear, and that's how the day and night cycle will work. It'll be a player controlled day and night cycle. I don't know for a fact that that's how that's going to work, but that's really the only feasible way I can imagine this working, really, because the game doesn't have a horizon. It can't have a normal day and night cycle like all other games with day and night cycles. So that'll be interesting. All right, that's all I've got to say. You've been a wonderful audience and all that. See ya.